Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to SIS. I'm your host, Hilary Ireland, and today we have another episode for you in the Starting in Science series. When starting out in science, the early career stage is particularly precarious for scientists. With a combination of a small job market and a limited number of highly competitive research grants, finding research funding and stable employment in New Zealand can be challenging. However, for the resilient researchers out there, there is hope. Today, through a discussion with our panel, we will learn about several funds administered by the Royal Society, Te Aparangi, and first-hand experience of applying, winning and utilising the funding. So without further ado, let's introduce the panel. First, we have Associate Professor Matt Templeton, Principal Scientist of the Plant Pathogen Interactions Team and the Key Contact at Plant and Food Research for Rutherford Fellowships. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Hilary. It's great to be here to discuss this really important topic.
Quite. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Dr. Kimberly Snowden, Science Team Leader of Plant Development Team, and the Key Contact at Plant and Food Research for Marsden Funds. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be part of the discussion today.
Great. Thanks for being here. And I'll just say here, both Matt and Kim also have experience on panels assessing Marsden and Rutherford Discovery Fellowship applications. Last but not least, we have Dr. J.G. Araman, Scientist of the Plant Pathogen Interactions Team, SciGEST podcaster and recipient of a Rutherford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship and Marsden Fast Start grant. Welcome, Jay.
Kia ora, Hilary. Thank you for having me back here.
It's great to have you. Thank you. So, there are many paths an early career researcher, or ECR as we like to shorten it to, may take when starting out in science. Today we will discuss some of the common decision points ECRs face in relation to funding their science careers and hear guidance and advice from our panel of experts. So our path begins with the submission of the PhD. It's an exciting time but also a scary time. Submissions may also signal the end of a stipend. Also, eligibility for many grants requires the PhD to be conferred, not just submitted. Additionally, there can be considerable time between submission and the oral defence, sometimes up to 9 months. So my first question to the panel is, what advice would you give to ECRs during this time of uncertainty? Should we start with you, Kim?
Sure. I think it's a tough one, really. It is a hard time. I think we need to acknowledge that. And because the length of time between submission and getting the PhD is so long and getting a grant takes so long, you have to be sort of prepared in advance, looking for opportunities perhaps with people prior to your submission. So there might be something that comes up before you're actually eligible to apply yourself. So I think working with other people to be part of their submissions is one thing to do, but keeping in contact with people, making sure your supervisors introduce you to people, make sure you're known to people by presenting your work, all of these things can help.
Yes, great advice. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, sometimes there might be opportunities for some short-term work in the institution where you did your PhD. One of my students has managed to get some money for writing up from School of Biological Sciences, so hunt around for those opportunities. And as Kim said, even though you're madly writing, you do need to be thinking about this before you actually submit. But yeah, agree, it's a painful time financially. You've probably spent most of your savings at the end of your PhD, and it's also an area that actually nobody really takes responsibility for. So
What
it's
do you
tricky.
mean by that?
I don't think universities have, specific funds, or say CRIs have, a policy or plan. It's really up to the student to sort something out, and maybe the supervisor's help.
Nice. And of course, CRI, we should all be familiar if we've listened to SciGEST as Crown Research Institute, which is, of course, what Plant and Food Research is. Yes, excellent advice. We need to plan for this time, for sure. Yes.
One other thing I will say is that on the positive side, it is a good opportunity to write up your publications before you start a new job, because you'll find it's really, really difficult to write up when you're working permanently. So from a financial point of view, it's a big negative, but from the point of view of advancing your career by writing up your PhD or publishing your PhD papers, it's a very worthwhile time. pluses and minuses.
So you mentioned that some universities do offer funding for that writing time.
I know Otago does. Mm-hmm. They have a specific fund for that. And Auckland doesn't necessarily have a specific fund, but there are discretionary funds that your group leader or HOD may have. I'm talking small amounts of money, maybe $3,000 or something like that, but better than nothing.
Quite. How about you, Jay?
Yeah, this is an interesting time, a really challenging time. So I'm going to talk about my own experience when I finished my PhD. So as every young person will be familiar with, typically when you run out of money, you go to the Bank of Dad and you ask for some support. So my supervisor, my PhD supervisor at the time, was in a different country. But I still went to my Bank of Science Dad and I said, look, I'm in this transitory phase. And, I leaned on the fact that, I had a really good relationship with my supervisor, and he reached out to contacts within the university, and we managed to find some money for me to do some casual work. So the work was, as Matt said, writing up the papers that had come out of my PhD, which, you don't have too much time during a PhD to do often. So the money was towards writing that, but also towards filling in the scientific gaps that are in there. And through the process of writing a paper, you'll often come across, gaps in your research that you haven't really focused too much on, that, the reviewers of a paper are really going to pick on. And so having some money to do that is always a really good idea, especially if, your project is changing, you don't have the right people to take over those projects. So, having someone that's done an entire PhD on that project and sort of extending their period of employment is a really good idea. And so, lean on the relationships that you built up during your PhD, reach out to your contacts, see what money is out there, what soft money is out there, in addition to what Matt and Kim have talked about. And I think it's a really tough time for a lot of ECRs. You finish this massive undertaking, and it's really stressful. You don't know what you're going to do next. You don't know where you're going to live. Let alone city, country, sometimes where in the world you're going to live. So you have to be flexible. It's good to think about this period, and thank you for asking this question. Before you go into a PhD, have a plan and work towards that plan. You know that, funding is going to run out at 3 years, or if you've applied for an extension, 3.5 years, have a plan for, hopefully you have some savings, or you have a science mom or a science dad that you've had a conversation with about some support through this period. Yeah.
Yeah, great advice. The common theme there is definitely plan for this time. It's coming. Don't put blinkers on and not plan for it. Yes, Kim.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, not everybody manages to find that little science niche in between, and that isn't the death knell to your research career. If you need to go and work in any other type of job, just keep in contact with people, let them know you want to be back there, that you're looking for that next research opportunity, and just keeping in touch so that you don't get out of mind of people, I think it can be really helpful too.
I would also add that if you're planning to do an overseas postdoc, that this would need to be arranged in advance of submitting your PhD, because they often run, possibly a year, 8 months ahead. What I mean by that is they're not advertising for a postdoc for next month. It'll be for a significant length of time ahead. So you need to be thinking about that probably before you're writing up, to be honest.
It's such a tricky time, really, isn't it? Go for it, Jay. Yep.
Yeah, so just to sort of address what period of time you need to be planning for, plan for the worst case scenario. Let's say, 6 months to a year of being on soft money, being in that situation. And so it's always good to have extra money. It's always good to have the plan and not need it. So you got to think that way.
So the next stop along the path is that the PhD is conferred and the graduate is finally eligible to apply for grants. There are a range of postdoctoral opportunities out there depending on your speciality, but today we will discuss the Rutherford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship. So Matt, can you tell us about the fellowship, its purpose, eligibility, how many awarded each year and success rate, and then any reflections on what the characteristics are of a successful application?
Well, broadly, they're to build capability in science and research, but also it's humanities and social science. There are now only 5 given per annum.
Wow.
There have been more in the past, for this year at least, and I think it's going to remain at that. Not sure how many applicants there are. Those stats aren't on the website, but it'll be dozens and dozens. So the success rate is low. It's also open to Kiwis returning from New Zealand. And the other thing I'm not so sure about is whether most of the successful applicants, whether this might be their second postdoc even. So I would think that it would be quite hard for someone straight out of a PhD to nail one of these guys. There are 3 panels. So there's a life sciences panel, physics, engineering and maths, and a humanities social science panel. Obviously, if you're going to apply, read thoroughly all the information on the Te Aparangi website, particularly the eligibility. So I guess a couple of areas where people have got stuck in the past is you have to have had your PhD. You don't have to have graduated, but it's got to have been conferred. So you've got to have passed your oral exam. And you've got to just be careful of the fine print in there which says, well, you can apply in between submission and your successful defence, but you need a letter from the uni, and they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to guarantee that you're going to pass your oral exam, right? So just watch that little bit of fine print.
Okay. And do you need to be at a host organisation or be employed?
Yes, and you can't be a permanent employee.
Okay.
To apply for the postdoc. Yes, and obviously you have to be employed by the institution during the tenure, but I don't think there's an obligation to necessarily to be permanent after that. Criteria for the discovery is slightly different, where I think you have to be employed by the institution.
No, I don't think they have to be employed, but there has to be a guarantee that they would be if they got the fellowship.
Yes.
Because
gotcha.
sometimes they have people who are returning from overseas, and they are then have a host organisation who has agreed to that they would be there, or they have a position lined up sometimes already as well.
Yep.
In most cases, from the ones I've seen, they're people who are already have a position, but it could be a huge range of what that position could be.
Yep.
So that's the
that's for the discovery fellowships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a 2-tiered application, so you fill out a form first, and then there's a short list who are interviewed. The other little catch you have to be aware of when you apply is you've got to notify your referees, and they've got to get their reports in on time. So the Royal Society doesn't chase up the referees. It's your job to make sure they get those reports in. In terms of a good application, like anything, it'll be novelty, the strength of your CV.
Novelty of the science area you're in?
Yes. I mean, you've got to be demonstrating cutting-edge research, that you're, well at the forefront of your field, even though you've just graduated necessarily with a PhD. But those are the criteria they'll be working on for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Matt. So, Jay, you have been awarded the Rutherford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship. What were the highs and lows of the application process for you, and what support did you receive once you had the fellowship? And lastly, in what ways did the fellowship propel your career forward?
A lot to answer there.
Yes.
I just wanted to first sort of talk about how I felt during the process.
Great.
So this wasn't my first grant application. This is my second grant application. Obviously, it's nerve-wracking, and there's a lot of imposter syndrome kicking in and that sort of thing. And I want to sort of validate everything that Matt was saying, and I experienced all of that, having that experience going through it. I had Matt's support to start off with, which is an incredible tool, and Kim supported me through all of this as well. And I had a whole team of support of scientists and researchers who looked through my application and gave me advice and pointers, and all of it really helped. But one thing that Matt didn't talk about that I want to talk about was during the interview in particular, and also that I mentioned in my application, were things apart from the science that I did. Mm-hmm. So I got the feeling very clearly from the whole process that they weren't so dead set on cutting edge research. The research has to be cutting edge, but that wasn't the driving factor. I was the driving factor, which was very strange to me because as a scientist, you tend to put science first every time. And for a change, they put the person first. And I thought that was amazing. And I really appreciated that. I got to talk about multiple things, but one of the things I mentioned was involvement in the SIS podcast, and they were really interested in that. So they are interested in things you do beyond the science. Who you are as a person is really important to this. So, wear that badge proudly. But you have to have every box ticked along the process of the application, and that's really important. Little slips are going to cost you greatly. Apart from the nervousness, there was this sort of exhilarating feeling of like living your true self. I don't know how to describe it. It was really amazing in the interview process, talking about what mattered and pointing out to this panel of largely non-plant scientists why I thought my work was non-obvious or obvious things that were perhaps maybe mind-blowing or like really interesting. Just sort of a segue. One of the things that I pointed out that in our field of research is that a lot of the research is done on like annual plants that have, one season and then they die, and the seed of those plants carries on the next generation. The work that I was proposing was for perennial plants. These are plants that live for decades. And as soon as I mentioned that, you could see their eyes light up. This is like something that really seemed really obvious to everyone in this institution, but not to the panel. So point out things about your research that you think that they might be interested in that you think are not obvious. And so little things like that will help you along the way and lean into why you find your research interesting. And for the personal side of it, I think it helped me reconnect with why I was doing the science that I was doing. And it was a very personal journey. And out of all the grants that I've applied for, I haven't done that many because still early in my career, hopefully. I found this grant application process, really rewarding.
Fantastic. Sounds like a wonderful journey, very transformational. I've got a couple of questions for you from what you've said. How many years post-PhD were you at the time that you applied? Right.
I was 2 years post-PhD, probably halfway through eligibility at that point. But yeah, you almost never feel ready enough, particularly if you can go onto the website and look at the past applicants and who's gotten it. Okay. And then you can do the online stalking and look at their careers, and you're like, oh my Lord, this is not me. I'm not going to be this person.
Hence the imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
kicking in.
I mean, I had a lot of that before that process, but it didn't help. I did get inspired, but at the same time, felt really like it was a really daunting process. But then when you connect back, you look at why you're applying things, and you reconnect to why you're doing this. It can really ground you, and it was amazing.
That's great. And I suppose because you were being interviewed by the Life Sciences panel,
yes,
is it fair to say, probably this is a question for all of you, that the Life Sciences panel would be heavily health focused, or is there a lot of research being funded in like the non-health space?
I think the Royal Society Te Aparangi work very hard to try and balance their panels.
Yep.
So they try to have a range of people from different backgrounds, from different types of institutions, gender and ethnicity balance as well. So it's obviously quite difficult when you have limited numbers on a panel, but they really do consider that quite strongly. So yes, you may end up with a few people in that area, but it doesn't mean that your area is neglected.
Yes.
The trickier thing is that some of our fields of science are quite small, and so there may be somebody on the panel that knows your research quite well, but they may well have a conflict of interest with you, and so having them there doesn't necessarily help because they're taken out of the process and don't score your proposal if there is a conflict. So I think that's the trickier thing, because New Zealand is so small that some of our communities are quite small.
Okay.
Yeah, so that Life Sciences panel includes environmental science as well. So I notice a number of the awardees would fit into that category.
Okay, great. And plant science wins, case in point with Jay's successful application, of course. You mentioned the grant application process was about the person, and you talked about your other extracurricular activities. What other characteristics about do you think, really helped to push forward your application as a person, as a potential leader in science?
That's an interesting question. I'm not too sure. I guess... Oh, this is so uncomfortable talking about myself at this point. I hope that they saw that I was very enthusiastic. I was really keen. At that point, when I did the interview, I received the email from them saying, hey, you've passed through the first round. We'd like to call you for an interview. And I forwarded that message to Matt, and Matt just was super excited. And that's when it landed that this was a big deal, that, so many people don't get through this process. And I was genuinely excited and enthusiastic that I might maybe, get to do the science that I'd proposed. It was really interesting to me. It was very personal to me. And I guess maybe that came through, and they were interested in sort of supporting me. They saw that I was interested in outreach. I talked about how I did outreach to schools, talked to young kids about science and why the work that we do here at Planet Food is really interesting. So they asked me a few questions about that. And I guess I was lucky that I had thought about or prepared enough to think about how my research fit into the greater story of Aotearoa. And so I was able to tell that story and why I thought that my research was important. And perhaps they connected with that in some way. It's really hard to tell, honestly. But I was 100% me, and I'm really grateful that they liked what they saw and liked the application, liked the science, and really grateful for the opportunity. That's all I can say.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming back to one of the previous questions, what support did you then receive once you had the fellowship at Plant and Food, I take it? Yep.
Yeah, so, to start off with, I was only able to apply for this grant because Matt had already applied for a postdoctoral position that was funded, and that's what I applied for to get my position at Plant and Food. And then through the process of application, Matt supported me, the whole team supported me through the process. But then once I'd gotten the grant, one of the things that you kind of have to get your head around is that your role, because you're on this temporary contract, your role has changed. You're no longer doing what you were doing before. You're now doing what you're now funded for, this new role. To start off with, I pushed it down the track. So I didn't start off as soon as I was eligible to get that money. I pushed it 9 months down, as far as I could push it, because I had very kindly extended the contract that I was already on. But then once I had to start this project, I had to give up a bunch of stuff that I was already doing. It's a different position, effectively. You're funding something completely new. These grants don't fund business as usual. They don't fund things that you're already doing. They're funding new things. And so you need to have that conversation with your team. I didn't have to have the conversation with the team. Everyone just sort of adapted to it. Everyone was just congratulatory and very supportive and just, helped me take things off my old plate and move things to my new plate. But part of the project was sort of using materials that I already generated from my first postdoc and then channeling it in a new angle towards my new postdoc, which was Rutherford postdoctoral fellowship funded. And so it was a smooth transition. That doesn't always happen. I can imagine that, especially if you do transdisciplinary research or your application is for such, you'd have to give up what you were doing before to do the new thing. But yeah, having good relationships throughout the process is everything. The support for applying, but also after applying, having that support and understanding, that acceptance, helping you take things off your plate and put new things on. That's all part of the process. That's the whole point of the relationship. That's the whole point of mentorship and support. And I was very grateful to have that in the team that I was placed in.
Yes, your story is an excellent case for building a good network and a good team around you. So, Kim, what advice would you have for newly anointed doctors considering funding applications at this stage in their careers?
Yeah, there's so many things to consider here. If you think you have some good ideas that you want to transfer into grant money, the first thing is it's not a solitary activity. Grant proposals are very much a team sport. And so make sure you talk about your idea with people. They may not necessarily be on your grant, but talk with a lot of different people. See if you can enthuse them about your idea. If you can't do that with one-to-one or something with people, then how are you going to do it on a page? So I think it's about being able to convey that excitement. But it's broader than that, because when you get down to the nitty-gritty, you have to figure out timing. Is it the right time to apply for a grant? Does my idea fit into what the grants will cover? There are some research ideas that might be very basic, others that might be very applied, and they fit different sort of types of grant application.
So you mentioned it's important to consider the right type of grant and when it's the right time. And I suppose at this moment in an ECR career, it doesn't necessarily need to be where you lead the science. It can be contributing on bigger grant applications with your principal scientists, such as like the Marsden Standard Grant and the Marsden Council?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think while I wouldn't want to dissuade people from going straight for their own grant, it's certainly a great experience to first be involved with a group that is putting one together where you might be an associate investigator instead of the principal investigator, and you can see their process and how many iterations they go through and how you might have your big idea on one page, but it might take you weeks to get that page perfect, rather than, it's not a half-hour job kind of thing. So seeing that process in the context of another group leading it can be a really valuable experience. But certainly, if you've got the idea and it's something that you want to go forward rather than helping out with somebody else's idea, then have a go. They're not trivial documents to put together, but they're a great learning exercise. And even if you don't succeed in your first attempt, you usually learn a lot more about what would be needed to flesh out a project. You have to read more deeply than you might have otherwise, and all of those things can really help pull a project together so that the next time you're better prepared.
Yes, don't underestimate the value of you being, say, a named postdoc on someone else's grant, because that really can help an application. Certainly I know from my experience on committees is that it can be a bit of an unknown if somebody, is looking for a postdoc but don't know who that person is. Mm-hmm. The advantage of, if that person is named, they can then, your CV is there, you can tell that you're a good person and that you would be hitting the ground running. Yes, I wouldn't underestimate the value of that. I'd also chip in and say, first option really should be looking overseas for positions. There's many, many, many of those. You'll be able to pick and choose some. So in the first instance, I'd be thinking hard about getting some overseas experience, building up your CV overseas, and then picking a time to come back to New Zealand.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, the corollary to that is that, when you're going into a PhD, you have to go in with your eyes open that, that these grants that we'll be talking about today are, largely low success rate. They're prestigious, wonderful things to get that really opens doors for you. So definitely a great idea to apply for them. But they're not your insurance plan. The insurance plan, the backup plan is, the main plan is really having a high success rate option, and that is international research. And so if you're going into a PhD and you don't have a solid job already that supports you through the PhD, really consider, is this right for me? Because the market is really shallow after the PhD. So, be flexible after the PhD and say, I'm able to travel overseas. That's a strength of mine, and therefore I go into the PhD with my eyes open. If you have a lot of dependence or sort of things tying you to Aotearoa, really figure out a more solid plan, because you can get into a lot of trouble otherwise. International research is well-funded, opens many doors for you like the local grants do, so having that as part of your plan is really important.
When you were considering overseas postdocs, did you use your network in New Zealand to reach out to them?
Yes. So when I was finishing my PhD, I had co-written a grant overseas in England, and the PI on that project was a close contact of my PhD supervisor. In fact, he was my PhD supervisor's PhD supervisor. And so I met this scientist when he came. I was in Korea at the time, South Korea, and he came for a conference, and we got to meet, and we hatched up the plan to apply for a grant together. I mean, that grant ended up being funded, but I wasn't the top candidate because you still have to apply for that process. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
No. Okay.
And I was really fortunate that a position at Play and Food opened up at that time, and I applied for it and was successful in getting it with Matt. So obviously my plan was to go overseas because there are way more opportunities in overseas, really well-funded programs. But there's nothing quite like being home. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a career in science demands resilience and flexibility and being okay, accepting of the challenges of precarity and the need to be mobile and agile. Yeah.
Unless you don't need to.
Unless you don't need to.
Yeah, there are ways around that. And I think we all acknowledge that we're people. Well, at least most of us try and acknowledge that we're people, and that means that we come with certain constraints in what we can do in our lives. And while I was one of those who also went, and I spent 3 years in the US postdocing before coming back to New Zealand, I didn't like the idea of doing that. I kind of wanted to stay home. I went, but I think there are plenty of people who can't for various reasons, and it shouldn't be held against them. But I think, as Jay said, you have to really figure out what your plan is, because it is harder to, if you've got a location in mind that you're stuck to, it's much harder to find somewhere or a place or a position that will work. So contacting the people in your chosen location ahead of time, talking about opportunities, whether or not you need to apply for a grant, whether they have things coming up, because both are possibilities, and I've been employed on both of those sorts of things where I've applied to get a position versus just needed to find something and looked for what was available. So they're both possible, and you can still find a path through your research career doing that. But certainly I think the most successful people are probably planning it a step or two in advance and really figuring out where the next best place is for what they want to do for their research career.
Great advice. Thank you all. So a common next stop along the path is where security has been found in a temporary postdoctoral position, but the clock is ticking on the contract. So one option you may consider is applying for a Marsden Fast Start grant. So Kim, can you tell us about the Fast Start grant, its purpose, eligibility, how many are awarded each year and the success rate, and then, of course, what the characteristics are of a successful application?
Sure. So generally, Marsdens and Fast Start are one type of Marsden, are there to support excellence in leading-edge research in New Zealand. A broader goal, like the Rutherfords that Matt mentioned, is also to help maintain a community of experts in a broad range of research fields in New Zealand as well. So they are investigator-led research. They're not subject to government priorities. So they're really about excellence of the idea and whether the panels think that you have the ability to do the research, got the right people involved, and can take it to completion. Mm-hmm. So they will be looking at your CV for evidence for those last parts of that. So you have to really make sure that during a research career that you have got things published and your name on them so that they can see that you've got to that point. And I know sometimes research takes a long path to publication, but do your best to try and maintain your CV to give yourself a good chance there. But really it's first about the idea, a really exciting, novel idea that ideally might change our thinking or really unlock our understanding of something that we don't really know about at the moment. A couple of other things to be eligible for the Fast Start. You need to be within 7 years of your PhD. That timeline can be paused if people have taken time out for science, for example, for parenthood, things like that. You have to be based in New Zealand, and the majority of the research should be carried out in New Zealand, though there are a few exceptions, for instance, if you need to go to Antarctica or something like that. The actual process is a two-step one, so you have an initial application which is assessed by a broad panel, so you need to be able to target your proposal to the specific type of panel you have. They won't be all in your field of research. In fact, none of them might be. Or there might be one, but they might have a conflict of interest with you. So you need to have your idea written in such a way that it will appeal to that broad range of specialists. If you make it through that stage, and about, I'm not sure of the exact number, around a quarter of the proposals make it through that first stage, you're then invited to write a full proposal. And when you do that, you're given more space to flesh out your ideas, and it is sent out for peer review, and that is sent out to international peer reviewers. They report back with their reports to the panel, and the panel then consider what all the peer reviewers have to say, plus you get to reply to those peer review reports. So if you think they have not understood something, you have a chance to try and make your case for their criticisms. And then the panel assesses all of those things together, and it is the panel that makes the decision. And overall, I think, I'm not sure if you asked this, but the overall success rate is somewhere between 10 and 13%, depending on how many applications there are. So last year, Fast Start's 13% got funded, but in other years it might have been as low as 10%, depending on the numbers of people.
So how many was that in numbers, roughly?
So in 2022, the Marsden funded 113 projects. It was something like $77 million, but 72 of those were standard grants, and 41 of those were Fast Starts.
That's great. They're good numbers. I mean, compared to 6 or 5.
Yeah, there are more opportunities,
Yeah.
definitely. But it still is, that between 10 and 13% success rate. So it's still a great result if you get to that point, but it certainly is not certain.
No, still very competitive.
Yeah.
So as well as a good publication record and interesting science, what else do you think makes a successful application for a Fast Start?
Well, there's so many things. I think being upfront with what your big idea is. Don't leave it to the last line. You need to capture the imagination really upfront. So it has to appeal to that broad audience. It needs to really connect the dots between your big idea and what you're going to do. Where I often see people fall down, they might have a great idea, but then I can't understand how what they've said they'll do will answer their big idea.
Right.
So connecting those dots is really difficult, but really necessary. And because you've got people outside of your field assessing it, it has to be obvious to people from different scientific backgrounds.
So how much time would you suggest putting aside to prepare your application?
At least a few months, couple of months.
Yeah, you need to.
It isn't necessarily that you're writing all the time, but you need time to get feedback from other people and incorporate it. You need time to talk to people about all the different aspects. And the other thing I'd say is really don't neglect all the other aspects of the proposal. We think of that, particularly in a Marsden, that the guts of it is in that one-page abstract of your research idea, but you have CVs to consider, you have your vision mataranga to consider, you have roles and resources, you have a budget, you have all these other things, and you should not leave them to the last minute or think that they're unimportant, because they all contribute.
Yes, great. Matt, your thoughts?
I'd add one other thing, and that is the committees or panels look at independence very closely for a Fast Start. So the more independent you appear from, your previous PhD supervisor, the better, in my view.
Okay.
Yeah, because, the panel won't like to think that, this PI who's got a big lab is essentially writing the Fast Start for.
That's really tricky, isn't it, in reality? No?
Not necessarily. I mean, the Fast Starts are definitely not a postdoc. They're really there to help people who've probably done a couple of postdocs really launch into their career, and that means it's your career. You're not an extension of anyone else's.
Yeah,
So-
you might be part of a group already, but the different projects you've done in your past trigger some great idea which is a bit separate from what else is going on in the group you're in, and this allows you to build some independence in your career and start off a project that might be a bit sideways from that, but brings together all the things that you know and understand, and you can see those gaps.
Still tricky, I think, because
It's
you need to
definitely
have
tricky, yeah.
because you would need to have the publication record to back that up. And
It's not necessarily that you need to have all the background exactly in what you're proposing, but you have to have brought on the experts that can help you where you have your gaps.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
where you're choosing your associate investigators is really key.
Okay.
So I feel like, okay, I have the idea, but I don't have the methodology. This particular famous scientist in wherever place around the world has that, and get their agreement to be part of it to bring those skills to the project.
got you. Okay, great. Regarding independence, are there other qualities that they look for when they're deciding whether you're independent or not, or does it really come down to that relationship or not with your PhD supervisor?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a straightforward one to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
But just trust me that panels look closely at it.
Mm.
I guess one bit of advice I would give is that if you're corresponding author on, say, your latest publication, that would be really good indication to the panel that you're driving that research. On the other hand, if the PI in your lab is corresponding author for your recent publications, then it's harder to convince a panel that you're the person leading that work. I mean, this can also be a lesson for PIs. There's a stage where they've really got to realise that for emerging researchers in particular, giving up that position of corresponding author can be really beneficial to someone beginning their science career.
Mm-hmm. Good consideration.
So I'd just like to add to what Matt and you were talking about, Hilary, in that, it can be a tricky topic to approach your PI to say, hey, can I be the corresponding author about this? But that's the whole process of leveling up to lead research like this, is having those conversations. And it's phrased as a question. Would you consider me? It's a negotiation that you have with your PI. And I think one of the things that we really sort of don't talk about is relationships in your professional experience in science. And so I'm a big fan of openness and, having these conversations. You start small, hey, can I lead this? Or can I lead this aspect? And I'll, report back to you, and for not just this, application or this paper, but, little projects, so you build confidence in your relationship with your PI. And so I look at that as, kind of an opportunity for you to build that relationship, but also for you to then have bigger asks of your PI. And say, hey, can I be corresponding author for this? And I'll do this writing, or I'll do this component. And there's a relationship there, there's a trade, there's a transaction there that, we shouldn't be afraid to engage with as ECRs. Mm-hmm. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it.
Mm. As you say, it's a negotiation, but one that needs to be had. So, Jay, you were successful in receiving a Marsden Fast Start grant. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What were the highs and lows of the application process?
This was the successful one was my second Marsden Fast Start. So I just want to talk about the first one really quick.
Yes, please.
When you apply for a Marsden, when you get feedback, so this is the first stage of the process where it's a one-page application and you go through and you hear about the success or failure, as it were. And they tell you based on, their feedback on what quintile rating you have. So it's, first gets through, second, not quite there, third, some significant issues. Fourth and fifth, we won't even bother giving you feedback. That's where my application was, fourth or fifth. So it was a huge hit, I felt really depressed. It took weeks to get over. And then, year passes by and that time comes again. You look back at your project And, you have to be resilient. You got to think, was this the best science I could have done? And you try and improve it. So my second grant application was pretty much the same project. So Matt talked about you being independent. So this project that I'd applied for was using exactly the same tools that I was working with before, the same pathogen, the same, plant system, but I moved it in a different direction. I was applying in an evolutionary direction. So that's something that we hadn't done. So that was the novel side. There needs to be something completely new. So this was, again, so my first application was like that. My second one was also about the same area. I applied a different tact to it. I had a lot of conversations post-rejection. And I really feel that my application changed so much. Even though it was about the same topic, it changed so much that it was a completely different beast. And so, you go in again, you build up your resolve, have all of those conversations. I have a sample size of 2. My first application went through 12 versions. Version number 12 was the one that I submitted. For the second application, the version that I submitted was, I think, 27. So if there's anything to go by, you will rewrite that application. This is a 1-page application. So many times, so many versions. You might often lose track of what version it is, but keep good records. And, every conversation that you have, you try and use that conversation to improve it. You sharpen the tip of that spear. And, there are factors beyond your control, but these are the things that you control. And I got lucky that, and I feel like I was fortunate. I can't say enough about luck and the factors that other people contributed towards my application. And it was successful. And that feeling was incredible. Again, I sent the getting through that first round to Matt. And his response in email was this massive font, YES, with, I don't know, like a dozen exclamation points. It is just a shared sort of, elation, because it's so hard to get through these. And everyone in the community understands that it's really difficult. And all worthy challengers are really difficult.
I totally agree with Matt's enthusiasm when you get through the first round, because once you get through the first round, your chances of funding are closer to 50%. So that is the biggest hurdle. And I've also been in your situation where I've had a Marsden awarded to me that it took me 3 years to get it funded. The first year I got through to the second round and then didn't quite get there. The second year, I didn't even get through to the second round. So I sort of felt like I'd gone completely backwards. And then the third year, we finally got there. But I think having that distance each time, working on the feedback you've got when I did get through to the second round, reading what the reviewers had to say, having some distance from it so that you can look at it with fresh eyes and really figure out, I really didn't connect the dots there between A and B or whatever. Well, that all helped. But also persistence. If you really care passionately about this particular project, it is possible to get it through. It may take you a while to get other people to see what you see in it, but don't give up.
Don't give up.
Yeah.
Resilience, yes.
I mean, I just want to add to that. I think it's particularly disheartening when you go through a few rounds of failure, but what really helped me keep perspective was the fact that the Marsden Fast Start, any Marsden grant, what you're applying for is money to fundamentally change your field of research. This is work that nobody else, all science, nobody else has typically done, but this is like something really fundamental, something revolutionary. That's the high bar that the Marsden panel set. And so it is well worth going through even a dozen rounds of failure and improving on it to try and change your field. And it's such a privilege to get one of these, to then add that level of science to the community. I really encourage every ECR to really put your efforts towards it, because, there's no higher goal, really, in this field. It's incredible.
Impressive, for sure. So you mentioned that the first attempt was 12 versions, second attempt was 27 versions. Did you go to a different panel with the second version? And how did the team size differ in terms of How many people do you think contributed to the first idea versus the second? How important was it to have a team?
That's a great question. I did go to a different panel. The first one, because I said it was in an evolutionary direction, I went to the evolutionary biology panel.
Great.
Wasn't so successful. The second time, I stuck to my bread and butter panel, which is the cellular and molecular physiology panel. But it was still the evolutionary angle, and it got through.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that that's necessarily why I was successful the second time. It's hard to sort of draw conclusions from that, really. I definitely think the number of versions had an impact. I mean, I look at version 12 versus version 27. So 27 started back at 1, by the way. It didn't start at 12. I mean, there were different approaches to it, different aspects, but there was so much nuance to it. And I probably spoke to about double the number of people for the second attempt than I did for the first. And I'd gone through the Rutherford experience as well. And so I had a little bit more confidence in sort of trying more risky things. And I think really every conversation that I had added to the research proposal. Everything. Like, you know, from how I pitched the idea, why is this important? I don't understand this. This is too dense for me. That is really useful feedback. It can be tempting to sort of just dismiss it. Oh, you're not an expert. Oh, you're not really reading this. But that's not true. Anyone that agrees to engage with you on this is interested. And the fact that they've given you that feedback, that is gold. That's make or break. Listen to it and learn from it.
Yeah, if I can add to that, because I think we can often get a bit defensive about our writing, and you have to realise these people are there. They may not have got what you've written, but you have to ask yourself why they didn't get it. Why have they not, been able to connect what you said up here to down here? And so you have to really reflect on why people have made suggestions. Sometimes you may not take all of their suggestions into changing your document, but you have to sort of definitely consider the why they have said something. And I think some of us who provide feedback on a lot of them try to explain that, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand that's what they're struggling with, but they're just like, the sentence is terrible, I don't understand it, kind of thing. And sometimes it really does come down to the real nitty-gritty there of this particular sentence just disrupts the flow, or the logic isn't there, or actually even sometimes little things like the grammar and typos or too many abbreviations just makes your text too dense, or doesn't give the panel confidence that you have that attention to detail and all these things to pull off the research. So you've really got to, all these little things can make a big difference.
Very tricky. So you got through the first round, you went through the second round. What were some of the lessons you learned from, thinking about the bigger picture of everything Kim mentioned before about the roles and responsibilities, the budget, who was going to do the research, how much support did you get from your organisation, Plant and Food, for being prepared to deliver the science? What was that side of it like?
Kind of like for my Rutherford application, the support, the networks that I'd built over the years was still there. Everyone was still supportive, and even more so. And I'm very grateful for that. Institutionally, there isn't a lot of support for the grant writing process per se. That's a very personal journey that you do with your network. Through the institutional process. It's a personal journey. You don't do it alone, as Kim said, but you do it with your people, your network. So just want to talk about the fact that the one-pager is very different to the full proposal. The full proposal has all of the details, and the details matter. And so you don't have any of that in the first one. The one-pager is the big idea, and you have to talk about some of the detail. But the majority of the details in the second application, that's what gets peer-reviewed. I was fortunate that when it went through the peer review process, the 3 reviewers that it went through were really positive about the research. They really were interested in it, and I could see that it just sort of jumped off the page at me. I basically got 2 big criticisms, and I incorporated them because they were great ideas. So it changed the project. And in retrospect, I'm really glad that I changed those 2 things because they made a huge difference to the actual research. So institutionally, not a lot has changed. I needed a student that was already incorporated as part of my research, and it was already part of the plan through Matt, who was the supervisor for the student. It's an ongoing project.
A PhD student?
PhD student, yes, absolutely.
So a couple of other things about grant proposals that, particularly when you're at a particular institution, is you should really contact the person at that institution who handles those grants to get advice, because most institutions do things slightly differently. They'll have different budget spreadsheets to each other. They might have slightly different policies of how various things are set up, and you need to sort of know those in advance going in so that you know and you need to do it early so that you know what is possible. A fast start is not a huge amount of money, and so it can be stretched quite thin. So if you think you're getting a fast start and you're going to hire 3 people to work on it, that's not going to happen, right? There's a minimum length of time that you have to commit to it yourself as the PI of a fast start, and that's true for most grant proposals. So a really big piece of advice is use the people in your institute to get details about what you can and can't do. Look at the guidelines for any particular grant proposal. They have heaps of information, and I'm frequently asked by applicants at our institute various questions along the way, and the first thing I do is look up the guidelines, and I frequently find the answer there and pass that on to them. Very occasionally I might have to go with my own experience or contact the Marsden Fund myself to answer the question. But I would say 90% of the time it's in the guidelines, so read them early. Don't make assumptions about what is possible if you don't, have that information already to hand.
Great advice. Yes, do the research as a researcher. Okay, great. So, Matt, an additional fund option at this time in an ECR's career is the Rutherford Discovery Fellowship. Can you tell us about that fellowship and, again, the characteristics of a successful application?
Well, these are targeted, I would say, to someone who's done at least a couple of postdocs, and they're targeted for people who have actually, their career has just lifted off, was just beginning to lift off. I would describe it that way. So actually 10 are given out per annum, so more than the postdocs. There were 12 last year, but I think there's budgeted for 10 this year. They're over a 5-year period, so you get money for a more extended length of time. They're also very competitive, so the worst stats on this, so 95 last year applied and 12 received, so that's 13% for New Zealand. That's probably not too bad. Again, there's 3 panels, and again, so they cover humanities, life and physical sciences. Something I noticed from last year's applicants that really some quite experienced people are getting these, so you can imagine, I think it's up to 8 years postdoc, isn't it? So a couple of 2 or 3 associate professors had them, so I known a lot of people around the country who have received these. A number of them have got them almost as soon as they've come back from the country, so they might have done postdocs in well-known institutions overseas. And I'm not sure I can say what the characteristics of a successful application would be, but I would imagine that high-quality publications would be very close to the top of the list.
Yeah, if I can pitch in there, because I have served on the panel. And it is a 2-step process, so I was only on the first step of that, which was passing a long list on that then became a short list. But again, when assessing them, we were assessing people from across a very broad spectrum, and it was very hard to really compare people from such broadly different backgrounds. And so you are looking a little bit at things like impact factors and publication records. But the great thing I found about the Discovery Fellowships is there's also a leadership statement. So you have your research proposal. So you're assessed on 3 things: your research proposal, your CV, but also this leadership aspect. And that is where you can really explain, I guess, what you're doing beyond just some experiments in the lab. I mean, experiments in the lab are our bread and butter, but it's connecting outwards. It is being a really good science citizen in a lot of ways, whether it's helping in your science community, leading various panels or organising various conferences or editing for journals. There's lots of other leadership things, activities that we can do as scientists, and it's making a really good story around that. And some people absolutely sing with what they are doing. It's also showing really appropriate and good knowledge of our obligations as good Te Tiriti partners, really putting the effort into a Vision Mataranga section where you have really good connections and that they're appropriate for the research you're doing, and that you are not just, well, you can't leave that one just to an also ran kind of thing. It is a really important part, and really good proposals do a good job of all of those things.
I will add one point to the discovery, which I know this may sound like a stupidly obvious thing to do, but you have a time frame that you're eligible. I would make sure you use that wisely, because with the discovery, if you're not successful the first time you try, you may not get the chance to apply again. So in the fine print there, it says if you were unsuccessful the previous year, give us a phone call.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realise that. I didn't see that aspect of it, because I certainly have seen people who applied more than once.
Yeah.
But,
So my reading of that is if you're in the lower quartile, we're busy people, don't bother us again. So, again, my advice would be make sure you put your very best foot forward and don't necessarily go too early in your eligibility if you're not sure, if you've got papers in the pipeline that haven't come through yet or things like that, as opposed to, say, the fast start where I would say go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
because
right.
There's no problem applying again. People often apply second or third time and are successful.
Do you get feedback to say what quartile or quintile you were in the rankings? No, we're not sure. Yeah,
don't know if we do.
And so what you're suggesting is kind of reflected in the eligibility criteria, that it's within 3 to 8 years post PhD.
Yes.
So more sort of mid-career researcher.
Yeah. Also, the fact that 3 associate professors got through last time suggests to me that it's on the latter end, and so I'd be very, very careful going in if you were, say, right at the beginning of the eligibility, unless you really felt that you had a super-duper case.
Okay.
You do need to assess them based on the number of years of experience they have, so you do temper your expectations based on how many years they've been there. But certainly after extra years, people have filled in more gaps in that leadership side of things. Their CV is fuller, and they are very competitive. There are some exceptional people out there applying for these things. So I don't want to dissuade people from trying, but I think if you have set up your career that you've gone, okay, I've got my PhD now the best thing for my career is to be at this particular lab because they've got this momentum going and I really want to be a part of this and I have something to offer, and you can see exactly how that's going to help build your CV. We don't all have the privilege of being able to do that, but I think those things really help because you don't necessarily get a solid, exceptional CV on your own.
No.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say this is very topical for me because I'm back on the writing grants horse, and so my latest application was actually a Rutherford discovery. So I've got about 7 years into post-PhD, so I've probably got 2 tries in me before I time out. So I've put the first application in, so let's see how it goes. Hopefully put my best foot forward. I suppose we'll find out.
Oh, good luck.
Thank you.
So let's talk about a very common stop along the path and the majority of cases people find themselves in. To the panel, what would your advice be to the unsuccessful applicant in terms of what to do next after receiving a rejection letter?
Yeah, I think you need time to process it. You need to sort of get through your disappointment or your frustration at perhaps getting feedback where people didn't quite take things the way you wanted them to. So you need time to sort of calm down from that, I guess. And some of us get through that process quicker than others. But really just don't give up. Put it away for a bit, come back in a month or two or however many, look at it with fresh eyes, ask different people to have a look, and don't give up because, as both Jay and I have said and many others, sometimes we don't succeed on the first attempt, but you can still get there.
Yeah, I would concur with all that. I've had the same experience of being knocked back. You've got to get back on that horse, not necessarily immediately, but the sooner the better. If you formulate an idea, it's always best that you figure out it's not so good rather than someone else. So what I mean by that is get into the thinking about your application, months before the due date. It's the best thing to do. The biggest mistake people hear that Kim will concur 120% on this is that people leave it to the last minute. They don't have time to see the flaws themselves, which is the better learning for these. Start, okay, you've fallen off the horse, dust yourself off, get back on, and start thinking many months before the due date. Because I think we'd all agree that the more you mull over that idea yourself and mould it and develop it yourself, the better it'll be. Use other people, of course, to sound off, but don't leave it to the last minute. Those are the ones with the typos.
The wrong templates.
Yeah,
Sorts of things.
Or the other bits not filled out properly.
Yeah, they've left things to the last minute.
Treated.
The worst thing is when they just haven't got in there and they've got an associate investigator who's in a different country who hasn't figured out how to agree in the portal to be part of a proposal, and you can't submit without that.
No,
so,
right.
You've got to make sure all those little tiny details are dealt with sooner rather than later, because you don't want to be the day before or the day of the proposal assuming somebody on the other side of the world can know how to do something. Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about is whether after failure you should get more preliminary results. And I'm in two minds about that one, because I think they can certainly help, and I think what I have seen of some other countries' grant processes is often preliminary results almost mandatory, and people almost have the whole thing stitched up before they get the grant, which feels kind of wrong to me, but it can certainly help inspire a bit of confidence. If you've got this great idea, you have to have something behind it. And that could be out in the literature, it could be your previous work, but occasionally you might need a preliminary result to convince the panel that your hypothesis is actually based in something more than you just pulling it out of fresh air.
Yeah, so I want to sort of say all of these things, basically. So you get a rejection letter, you go home, you have a bit of a cry, and then you come back to work and you talk to your colleagues, and the first thing you do is you have a cathartic event, like you complain about this and that and how this is really hard and, is it even worth it? At the back of your mind, it is worth it, but, you say it, is this even worth it? Why do I bother? And then, what you're applying for is really cutting edge, right? It's really fundamental. So what you've very quickly got to do is carry on the reading. This is not your day-to-day research. This is research that nobody else was going to do unless someone else is already doing it. So you keep reading your field of research and you look at the improvements in the field, and that will give you some ideas. And then the other thing that you can do, perhaps maybe contrary to what Kim was saying, is there are smaller grants internally within institutions that you can apply for to do some prelim studies. Apply for those because, as Kim did say, they are huge confidence boosters, that can help you refine your story a little bit more. Some of these internal grant processes, instead of giving you one page, gives you one paragraph, 250 word limit. Imagine writing an idea in 250 words as opposed to a page. That's really sharpening your spear. So, going through that process can help you quite a lot. You might not be successful internally, but there are no limits to the number of tries you can do year to year. And so, if you get some preliminary data out of that, that can help you refine the sense of direction that you get from it. You can mention that in your full application if you have a chance. But obviously you wouldn't do the whole thing. That's just cheating. But, these little things that you can do, have a conversation, reconnect with your network, rebuild up your confidence, and put on that suit that you wear, the grant application suit that gives you the confidence, wear your special tie, and you go off again to the races.
One option for ECRs is to start with sort of smaller grants where the odds on getting them might be higher. So, for example, a Catalyst, which also introduces you to the importance of overseas collaboration, because basically a Catalyst, that's what it's about.
That's Ministry for Business Innovation and MB.
That is MB, yeah. So it's MB as opposed to Royal Society funding, yeah.
We've talked a lot about the importance of having a team around you when you're developing your ideas and for support in general. And so when you look back on your careers, anything you would like to share with ECRs when you reflect upon the importance of having a good team of peers and mentors and advisors around you to develop your career?
I don't think you can overemphasize how important other people are, really. I know there are some special people out there who can get through the whole process without anybody else looking at a single word. But I think most of us are not that person. And it's just getting that diversity of opinion and building those relationships that you can get advice really helps. And we also try to help pay it forward as well, to help other people, make sure people are introduced to others in their field or within the country, and give people opportunities. So that's for the non-ECRs who might be out there listening. Make sure, that the ECRs you know of are getting those opportunities and help support them.
Yes, I think that this is particularly relevant, well, for everything, but particularly a fast start, because you're introducing that, or you're expecting this quite broad committee to then judge on it. And if you can't bring yourself to share that idea and get input from other people in your team, then how can you expect an even broader range of people to find your application easy to read and understand? It's absolutely vital to have members of your team in the first instance read over your application. And again, I'm sure Kim will agree with me, this is often the hardest thing to get people to do.
Yeah, they run out of time or whatever.
Yep.
So, or they're scared of the feedback they'll get, or they're like, I'm so invested in this page, I don't want to change this, so I don't want to ask.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of put your personal feelings about it aside and go, no, actually what's important is the success and making the best proposal. And it's hard. It is something we have to get used to, because it can feel quite negative. I think a lot of people will try and say, look, I think this is an exciting idea, but this bit here, you lose me a bit. But not everybody. Some people are more blunt in their feedback. And so it's just trying to figure out how to deal with that. But I think so having people you know and really trust to approach is the best way to start, that you know that they've got your best interests at heart, and that they're doing this because they want to help. So I think some of us who may have been around a bit longer, it feels a bit more natural, and sometimes we can forget how hard it is to get that feedback early on, but I think it really is a key thing. I hope whoever has listened this far into the podcast, if they take one thing away, it's that getting help, getting feedback, taking it to heart.
Yeah, I have an interesting way of doing this. So I have a very high first gauntlet. So the way I come up with these grant applications is, obviously the idea always comes when I'm having a shower. And it's always like, in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is amazing. This is $1 million idea. It's going to be funded. My first call, it's actually a text message, is to this group chat that I have with my fellow PhD students from Massey University and then in Korea. So there's 4 of us, and we're all on this chat, and I put the idea in there, and they're absolutely brutal. Because we're friends, they feel comfortable ripping it apart. And if I get through that gauntlet, I have a reasonable amount of confidence. So fail fast, fail early is a strategy that I use. And the people that I'm comfortable doing it with are these really close friends, my family, basically, I consider them, and that I'm still in touch with, even though we finished our PhDs like 7 years ago. And they do the same. They reach out with ideas and, I'm looking for a job. Do you know of jobs? That's the sort of networking. And that's the first network I go to. It's absolutely brutal. Sometimes it's really painful. They'll reply, ripping your idea apart, and then I don't reply for a day because I'm really upset. And then, it's natural to respond a little bit defensively, but then you sort of together refine your idea into, there's always a nugget. So getting to that nugget is really what that's about. And then I start the process of idea development, reading around it, to see that someone else hasn't had this wonderful idea, which is often the case.
Yeah.
But then you sometimes chance upon things that nobody's thought of, or someone's thought of but hasn't had the right tools at 10 years ago, and now's the right time to do it. Yeah, so my strategy is having a high gauntlet of close friends that will basically tell me that my idea is crap.
Yeah, I think
none of them
this...
are New Zealanders, of course. We're much nicer. This is the thing.
Yeah, I think that really is important, because sometimes people a bit removed might be a bit more gentle. They might not give you the hard truth, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes we need that.
Yeah. So, in your PhD, find your people. Find the ones that you're going to stay in touch with, purely for the utilitarian purposes of, I have a grant idea, please rip it apart.
I would advise a thick skin as well, along with that. And lastly, to the panel, is there any other advice you'd like to share with ECRs who are wrestling with decisions around funding?
I have one little thing that I don't think I've covered elsewhere, which is really, and I've hinted at it, your panels have broad expertise. You've got to appeal to that broad panel, but they also have a very limited time to look at your proposal. And I've heard people on panels say, I have no more than 20 minutes to read each one. For me, I'm slower. When I've assessed them, it's taken me a lot longer. But sometimes they're very time-poor people, so don't make it hard on them. Just realise that if you can't get across something in those first few minutes, you may have lost them.
Great advice.
I'd concur with that. Panellists may get 80 or 90 applications, and even at 20 minutes, there's still a fair whack of your time. So, you've really got to grab them early. You've really got to capture people's imaginations early on. Then you've got the chance, oh, yes, I better read this. This looks pretty good. Yeah,
the inclusion of figures. A figure tells 1,000 words, as the old saying goes. But I think not putting in figures that are just there for figures' sake, but there is some data out there, I remember reading, that grant applications with figures are far more successful than grant applications without figures, because we prefer looking at figures than reading text. That feels more like work. And so, having a powerful figure, sometimes makes all the difference. But it can't be just something for show. It has to be something that means something. So think a lot about what figure you're putting in, how it adds to the story that you're telling, and try and cut out words from your application and save them for better use later. So figures.
Or even just some formatting. If you're just hit with a wall of text where somebody's fit in as many words as they can in the space limits, that's really hard to read. And it might sound quite trivial, but just a little bit of formatting, a little bit of indenting, or the odd bolded or italics words or something, just to help keep that reader on track, can make a big difference too. But I agree. A good figure will really, really help. A bad figure, it takes up space that
you could have used otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of other things I'd say. Don't forget, deadlines are not flexible. They might have been flexible for, submitting your thesis, but they really are not with grants. And the other thing is get familiar with the portal really early on. There can be little tricks there that you really don't need when you're stressed out with the deadline looming. So just look at those early on if you can.
Yes, and remember there may be internal deadlines as well. So it's all very well saying that Royal Society says the 5 p.m. on the 13th. Internally in the organisation there may be an earlier deadline. Especially if you're the poor person that has to press the final submission button.
Yeah, that's a personal plea, isn't it? Sometimes?
Yeah.
I guess, one final thing. Just want to reach out to all the ECRs out there and just say, just go for it, you know? What do you have to lose apart from a few sleepless nights? And, you know, what's that really in this economy?
Brilliant. This has been a real treat. Thank you all so much for sharing your time, sharing your expertise and your knowledge. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hilary.
And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to know more about this episode, you can check out the SIGEST episode pages at plantandfood.co.nz. Please feel free to subscribe to the SIGEST channel and rate and review each episode. Why not give it 5 stars? Thank you and mā te wā.